It's time to engage your brain and enter the mind's eye on Z Talk Radio. I'm your host, Brian Turnov. Don't forget to check out the brand new The Mind's Eye Twitter account at Mind's Eye Show. News, pictures, politics, science, sports, more. Spice of life. You get it by now. Twitter account at Mind's Eye Show. Get ready for a trip into the dark side of humanity with tonight's guest, Dr. Scott Bonn. He is a professor of criminology, media expert and analyst, public speaker, and author. Dr. Scott is also an expert on criminal behavior and the motivation of criminals. We're talking shop on his latest book titled Why We Love Serial Killers, which is about the public's rampant fascination with serial killers. But why is this so? Could it be that some of us have a gruesome fascination with serial killers, really for the same reasons that we might morbidly stare at a catastrophic automobile accident? Or is it something more? Dr. Scott Bonn will provide new and unique insights into the world of the serial killer, including those he's gained from the correspondence with two of the world's most notorious examples, Son of Sam and BTK Killer. All of that and more back in a minute with Dr. Scott Bonn on The Mind's Eye Show. We're back with the good doctor, Dr. Scott Bonn, and talking about his latest, Why We Love Serial Killers. And Doctor, I greatly appreciate your time and joining us on this edition of The Mind's Eye. It really is a pleasure to have you here.
Well, likewise. I'm so happy to be here, and I appreciate you asking me to be on the show.
And let me just give a quick prerequisite warning to our listeners, because our show might be dealing with some stuff that some people with a weak stomach might not enjoy. But if you're in for a fascinating ride into the human condition, this is definitely your ride. And I really enjoyed your book, and the book itself, it's not really just about serial killers. It asks some really provocative questions about society and humanity, and it really left me chewing on subjects and left me chewing on the fat for days afterwards. And the title, Why We Love Serial Killers, it's kind of singed with irony, quite frankly, and it may seem a bit self-explanatory, but just give the listeners a brief premise of what the book is.
Sure, absolutely. I consider it really a sociological and pop culture look at serial killers in our society. And serial killers are part of our popular culture. It's undeniable, and they have been really catapulted into icon status. And it's in both fact and fiction. We have serial killers like Ted Bundy or Jeffrey Dahmer, real serial killers who have taken on this, what I call a celebrity monster status. But then we also have them in fiction. We have Hannibal the Cannibal Lecter. We have Buffalo Bill, John Doe in the movie Seven. We have even Freddy Krueger and Michael Myers would constitute serial killers by the official definition. So I went about trying to understand how they fit in, and I'm a criminologist. I study the patterns of crime and the motivations of all sorts of criminals, but I'm also trained in sociology, and it's very much apparent to me that that serial killers have been socially constructed, and some of them are actively involved in their own identity creation, like the Son of Sam. David Berkowitz and Dennis Rader, Bind, Torture, Kill, are examples of serial killers who sought public attention and actually gave themselves their own pseudonyms or what I call brand names. They're brand name serial killers. And it's really it's how they fit in and why we are so fascinated by these individuals.
And it really is such an important subject to talk about, because we really need to explore it to be able to identify them and hopefully maybe even be able to protect us from them. And taking that perspective from the sociological cycle, that perspective, that seems to be able to key us in on at least being able to identify them. And as I was reading your book, obviously you came to the conclusion that part of, you're a proponent of the idea that really the most relevant vehicle to examining serial killers is this really interesting concept of enemy. You mind talking about that a little bit? Because that kind of really serves as a foundation for what we're going to be talking about.
Sure, absolutely. Well, again, I'm trained originally in sociology, and the gentleman who's considered, by many to be sort of the founder and founding father of sociology is a guy by the name of Emil Durkheim back in the 19th century, and he came up with this concept called anomie. And essentially, what that is when something happens in a society that knocks it out of kilter and creates essentially chaos and fear, and people don't know how to react. And I realized that a serial killer, when one is active in a community, it does just that. It creates this sense of chaos and fear, and no one is safe, etc. And society needs to right itself. It needs to bring itself back into balance. And I argue that the way that we do that in regards to serial killers is by dehumanizing them and turning them into what I call celebrity monsters. If you look at the news media, if you listen to law enforcement officials describe them, they almost invariably use terms like monster. They say they're pure evil. They call them vampires, Dracula characters. They use these inhuman sorts of descriptors and titles for them. Well, what that does, I argue, is it really eliminates the need or the necessity of understanding them. It puts them into the category of just pure evil. They become literally Frankenstein monsters and Dracula characters, and we don't have to understand such things. We just need to destroy them in order for society to be safe. And so I believe that is exactly what we do with these individuals. And the reality, of course, is far more complex in terms of how these individuals evolve. And there's always a backstory and an evolution. People just don't, from day one, become serial killers. They evolve. And what I really see the danger here is in reducing them to these monster-like characters and creating almost a glorification of them. Because, as you know, you can buy Jeffrey Dahmer books, movies, games, puzzles. There are Jeffrey Dahmer cannibal jokes that are part of our popular culture to this very day. And this sort of glorification of them, what it does is it takes the focus off of their victims. And somebody like Jeffrey Dahmer killed 17 young men and even ate them, as a lot of your listeners may know. He was a cannibal. Ted Bundy killed 36 young women. We know their names. Everybody knows Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer. But what about any name of one single victim? Can anyone identify the name of one of the 36 women that Bundy killed or the 17 men that Dahmer killed? Probably not, because we have cast them in sort of an immortal status, but and remember them, but not the victims. And so I think it does tremendous harm to the surviving families of these individuals.
And it's so true, and I think part of the reason is, for at least most of us, maybe not outside of the people that are collecting the murderabilia, is really that there's this form of cognitive dissonance when we come face to face with the idea of serial killers. And like you said, we kind of have to, in a sense, almost compartmentalize them or dehumanize them to be able to deal with, hey, this is a reality that we probably won't have to deal with on a day-to-day basis or ever deal with, but there is that chance, and it's always kind of lurking in the back of our minds, so to speak.
Yeah, well, it reduces the fear to a certain extent, and it takes away this uncertainty. How could a human being possibly do this? Because that's part of the fascination with serial killers is the fact that they do these incomprehensible things to normally complete strangers. Yeah. They are capturing, in many cases, stalking and capturing individuals, and they torture them and kill them, and in some cases have sex with their dead bodies. This is just reality. It happens. And eat them in some cases. And it's incomprehensible to the average person how this could happen, how another human being could do that to someone else. And so by reducing them to these sort of one-dimensional, cartoonish monster Dracula characters, we don't have to understand them. It takes away our need to understand them. And going back to the anomie concept, it helps to bring society back into balance is very useful, and also part of that theory, part of the function. It's called functionalism theory that Anime came from, that Durkheim was responsible for, is this idea that everything, no matter how extreme it is in society, every individual serves a purpose. And you could argue that serial killers serve a purpose, and again, this is an ironic sort of notion,
Yeah.
but if they serve a purpose by delineating or establishing what is the absolute outer boundary and most extreme act that a human being could possibly perpetrate. And as a result, they sort of delineate the notion between man and monster. You know, what's the cutoff point between man and monster? Well, it's pretty much what serial killers do.
Yeah, and that's when your title and what you just said, that serial killers, they serve a function in society. I mean, taking that on face value alone, that is a bold statement and really terrifying to think about, because really it really rings a bell on the truth. It really helps us to put our I guess labels on morals and concepts of that nature.
Exactly. And I realize, I mean, the title is extremely ironic. Why we love serial killers?
Yeah,
we don't
with
love
irony.
serial killers, but we are extremely fascinated. And not everyone, I mean, I'm sure there are among your listeners, and certainly the general population, there are people who are not fascinated by this subject, but there are others who are. And the millions and millions of books and movies and TV shows. I mean, just look at all of the TV shows that feature serial killers.
My God.
They're among the most popular crime character out there, and in fact, I think I love to point this out because it's such a contradiction. Serial killers are extremely rare in reality. Of all the homicides committed in the United States, serial killers represent 1% or less of all the murders that occur in the United States. Yet if you look at all the TV shows that feature them, the movies, and the news stories about them, you would think that they're much more common, much more active, more prolific than they really are. And that's because we give them their undue amount of attention.
Yeah, no doubt about that. And like you're saying, that the network, the TV, network TV, the way they report it, it's just so sensationalized. It's just so biased and really unbalanced in the way that they present it. And it's obviously all for business profits. You have an intimate knowledge about that. We're going to come to that later. And so the media really continues to perpetuate these myths that you're talking about. And that's why I'm really glad that you're here, that we can really set the record straight a little bit. So really what you're saying, if you just go by what the media, you would think that almost every single serial killer, which you talked about in the book, they're white men, they're isolated from society, they're bloodthirsty, they're crazy, evil geniuses. But obviously, when you read the book, that's not what you're presenting. Talk about some of the media stereotypes and really how it differs from what your knowledge and your research shows us.
Sure, absolutely. The standard mythology of serial killers is that they are these loner white males in their probably their 30s or 40s who are rather dysfunctional and live off by themselves. And the fictional prototype of that would be like Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs,
right,
or the Tooth Fairy in Red Dragon. They would be that sort of dysfunctional loner, oddball character, but definitely a 30-something white male. The reality is that there are female serial killers, and there are serial killers of every religion, race, and ethnicity in the United States. And in fact, this is, as a criminologist, these patterns and statistics fascinate me. But here's one for you. Of all homicides committed in the United States, about 10% of them are committed by women, and there are roughly 15,000 homicides committed every year. Now, there are only 1% of all the homicides, or roughly 150, are perpetrated by serial killers, but about nearly 20%, between 15 and 20% of all serial killers are actually women. So statistically speaking, purely looking at statistics, if a woman kills, statistically, she's more likely to be a serial killer than a one-time killer. So serial killers are actually overrepresented among women, if you follow me.
Yeah, I was reading that, and I was wondering, why do you think that is? I mean, I guess it's really, obviously it's hard to pinpoint, and that's really what, I guess, part of what you're talking about is, but there really seemed to be such a disproportionate number. Can you?
Yeah, well, it's still a minority. I mean, we're still talking 85% of serial killers are men, but still 15% are women, and very, very few people realize that. And serial killers, female serial killers, it's important to point out, kill for different reasons. Male serial killers are much more likely to murder for a bloodlust, out of some fantasy lustful need that only they understand, and that would be the Ted Bundys and the Dahmers, etc. But female serial killers are much more likely to be pragmatic in their killings. They're more likely to be what's known as the Black Widow variety, where they are oftentimes nurses or perhaps operate a rooming house. And there was a classic example. Her name was Dorothea Puente, lived out in California, and she ran a rooming house. And her clientele was elderly citizens. What she would do is she would bring them in. She would milk them dry of their money, their savings, their insurance money, their state money, and then kill them when she had taken all of their money and bury them in her backyard. And she buried a number of her hotel guests or her rooming house guests right out back. That's a more typical female serial killer, killing for what's known as comfort or gain. So they kill for different reasons. Female serial killers are also more likely to kill family members, intimates, people they know well, whereas the men are more likely to prey upon strangers. But that's just one myth. There's the myth that they're all white, and that's simply not true. There are African American serial killers, Latino serial killers, Asian serial killers. The reason that these myths are perpetuated has to do with, and I talk about this in my book, has to do with the victim, the victimology or the victim type. White male serial killers tend to kill white women because homicide in the United States, whether it's serial homicide or one-time, an individual homicide, is referred to, or it's intra-racial, meaning that whites kill whites, blacks kill blacks, Latinos kill Latinos. That's the reality. There's, another myth in our society is that it's interracial, whites killing blacks, blacks killing whites, etc. That is an extreme rarity. The fact that white male serial killers kill young white women receives a tremendous amount of media attention, a disproportionate amount of media attention, and those are the stories that tend to become high profile. The African American serial killers killing African American women or African American men, for that matter, tend not to get nearly as much media exposure. So it has to do really with the profile of the victim.
And with the women killer, and I pretty much agree with the argument of the book that obviously the sensationalized network TV and their biased reporting of the serial killers, but it seemed like that the way that TV networks report women serial killers is actually fairly accurate. Most of the time they do describe them as Black Widows. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. But the stories are few and far between.
True.
And when they do occur, they tend to receive very, very cursory, short, limited coverage. Whereas when you have a prolific, high-profile male serial killer who's killing women, it tends to receive massive media attention. And ironically, actually not even ironically, directly as a result of the way that she killed, the female serial killer who received the most attention and is probably most well known to your listeners is Eileen Wuornos,
right.
The highway prostitute and serial killer
made
who
famous
was
by
brought to
Charlize Theron
infamy in the movie Monster by Charlize Theron a few years ago. And the reason, I talk about this in my book, I firmly believe that the reason that she became so infamous is because she killed like a man. She carried a gun and shot, men, complete strangers, in a very cold-blooded manner, more like the way a male would. Female serial killers tend to kill typically in more passive fashions. They tend to poison their victims, drug overdoses, that sort of thing, maybe smother them, but they typically don't shoot or stab or strangle them the way that males do. So I really think Eileen Wuornos rose to infamy because she killed like a man.
Fascinating. Let's try a little bit to get into the mind of a serial killer, as really as scary as I thought that is, and you do a great job of doing it because obviously you spoke with serial killers, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. And you're a criminologist, like we said. You're a firm believer in psychology is the key to understanding serial killers, and you talked about the psychological conditions that serial killers seem to possess, and they all either seem to be a sociopath or a psychopath. And you mind explaining the difference there?
Sure, absolutely. The sociopathy and psychopathy, first of all, are considered antisocial personality disorders. They're not considered mental illness. A psychopath and a sociopath, what manifests them, or what the characteristics are, a lack of empathy, the inability to connect with other human beings and feel any sort of remorse or pity, etc. And that's what enables them to do these horrible things and then go home and sleep at night, oftentimes like a baby, and not have any remorse. It's important to make the distinction between these antisocial personality disorders and something like someone who is psychotic or has delusions. These people are not delusional. They don't hear voices, that sort of thing. They simply are disconnected, unplugged from the rest of us. And there is a distinction. I believe that there's a very distinct distinction between sociopaths and psychopaths. Not everyone thinks there is. Some people use the terms almost interchangeably, but I think there is. And here's my take on it. A psychopath is someone who is just completely disconnected from other human beings. Imagine, if you will, an electrical cord for an appliance plugged in the wall. If you pull that plug out of the wall, the appliance doesn't work. Well, that's the way psychopaths are. If that electrical cord is like empathy, what enables another person to connect with one another, for a psychopath, it's just completely pulled out of the wall. For a sociopath, it's a little bit different. Imagine a cord that's faulty, that's sort of half in and half out of the wall. It works sometimes and not others. And as a result, sociopaths are able to connect with some people emotionally in certain situations, but not in others, and they connect with some people and not others. As a result, sociopaths tend to be a bit more temperamental and volatile. They tend to be angry and have mood swings, and you can see them coming better than a psychopath. A sociopath is more likely to seem disturbed and to have problems, whereas a psychopath tends to be a cool as a cucumber. They're just unflappable. Nothing bothers them. This is the Ted Bundy type, that just nothing bothers him. He's absolutely unflappable. And the one that I corresponded with and write quite a bit about in my book is Dennis Rader,
right.
Who named himself Bind, Torture, Kill, BTK. Some people will know him by the BTK label. He gave himself that name in a letter to the police because he was seeking publicity. He was not happy with the amount of publicity that his crimes had received, so he wrote a letter to the police and said, well, how many people do I have to kill to get a little publicity around here? Call me Bind, Torture, Kill, BTK. And this is a guy for whom human beings are nothing but objects. In fact, he referred to his victims as projects, interesting projects, almost like it was a hobby, like killing and torturing was a hobby for him. I should say it was a hobby. It actually was a hobby.
That was his
although
passion.
he was compelled to do it. He felt that there was this undeniable impulse that he had to kill, and when it would overwhelm him, he had no control over it. So he would be a complete psychopath. Dennis Rader, BTK, is a complete psychopath. He feels nothing when it comes to other human beings.
And we're talking about the myths, and one of those myths was that they're isolated. But someone like Dennis Rader and you noted other serial killers actually had families, but they're psychopaths at the same time. So I was wondering, do they have any emotions toward their family, or is it just a complete cover-up to help them kind of slither around, in a sense?
I believe it's the latter. A psychopath tends to be there, not always, but they tend to be very intelligent. In fact, there have been psychopathic serial killers who have had genius level IQs. Not all of them. I mean, that's a myth that they're all like Hannibal Lecter geniuses.
Right.
But there was a guy by the name of Ed Kemper who was referred to as the co-ed killer, and he actually had a genius level IQ, and he is a complete psychopath. And so individuals like that, like Kemper, like Dennis Rader, they are able to mimic emotion. They're very intelligent, so they know what the right thing to say is in a given circumstance. They know how to react, but they just don't feel it. So they're essentially play acting. They're going through the motions, and what they're very good at. And Dennis Rader explained this to me in his letters. We corresponded for a couple of years. That he compartmentalized his life. There was one part of his life, and think of it like he had in the house. There was the daddy room, and then there was the BTK torture room. And when he went into the daddy room, he functioned like a normal father. Took his kids to the park, to the zoo. He had a job. Dennis Rader was actually the president of his Lutheran Church Association. He was a Boy Scout leader. He was a very highly regarded man in Wichita, Kansas. And this was over a 30-year period that he was also BTK, bind, torture, kill. So when he would literally go from one compartment or one room in the house to the other, and when he was in the BTK room, then that was all consuming, and he would kill and torture and do the terrible things that he did, and then he'd reemerge from there, unflappable, unmoved, and go back into the husband room or the daddy room and sit down and have dinner with the family as if nothing had happened. That's a real psychopath.
Yeah, it really is scary to think how chameleon-like the serial killers are. All these institutions that we put our trust into and have these expectations that they're gonna tell us the truth. They use them as holes for them to go into and to really kind of fool us, and it's really disturbing to think about that these institutions are actually giving them the ability to do what they do, and that's really a horrid thought to think about. And part of that is, you noted a statistic in the book that 1% of the U.S. population are psychos, and if I'm doing the math correctly, and that never really was my strong suit, that's about 3 million psychos currently walking around. And I read a recent study, I'm sure you probably heard of this too, that supposedly shows that psychopaths are concentrated in certain professions, like CEOs, lawyers, media. I definitely believe that one, by the way, since we're both in it. I'm sure you do too. And also the clergy. And these are significant spheres of influence that we, the common people like me and you, are affected, and we probably don't even really realize it.
Right. Well, as you mentioned, I worked in the media and advertising world for about 20 years, and I would suggest that I came across a couple along the way. But you bring up such an important point. I actually have a colleague over in the UK. His name is Kevin Dutton, and he studies psychopaths, but psychopaths who are highly functioning and highly successful. And it is true, and it's so important to explain. not all psychopaths are serial killers. Not all serial killers are psychopaths. And in fact, many psychopaths are not criminals at all. What they are is unfeeling human beings who are very goal-oriented, who don't mind stepping on people along the way. So if your goal is to be a corporate CEO or a politician or something, a leader of some sort, this lack of feeling and lack of compassion could actually lead to success because you're not concerned about what you do along the way. So yeah, these individuals, and because they're oftentimes intelligent, it can lead to very successful professions, even in medicine and surgeons.
Right.
The ability to function under tremendous stress in a very, very effective way.
And that was actually one of the professions that they listed that was actually considered to be highly concentrated for psychopaths. And I was really almost dumbfounded in a sense when you hear something like that, because you think of surgeons, so you think just automatically they're in it for, I guess, the greater good. But does that necessarily relate to psychopaths? Is there a greater good when it comes to psychopaths?
Well, not really.
Right.
They're very self-serving and very, there tends to be a major correlation between narcissism, being self-absorbed, and psychopathy. So a guy like Dennis Rader, for example, is both narcissistic and a psychopath, and it's just all about Dennis. Nothing else matters. But getting back to the psychopath again, it's so important to say that. Remember what a psychopath is. It's an antisocial personality disorder. What it really is people who just don't have feelings and regard for other human beings. It doesn't mean they're going to be criminals, right? It just means you don't have regard or empathy with other human beings. Now, without a doubt, there's a correlation there, and many, many serial killers are psychopaths. Here's what I think happens. Because people ask me all the time, are serial killers born or are they made?
That was my next question.
and I really believe that it's a combination of the two, particularly among psychopaths. Individuals like Ted Bundy, Dennis Rader, Jeffrey Dahmer, who I believe really, really are psychopaths. There's a genetic predisposition for it. I am not a neuroscientist or a neurologist, but people have done recent studies to demonstrate that the brain of psychopaths works differently. It just the brain patterns fire differently. They respond differently to stimulation. They respond differently to stress. The psychopathic brain is different, and I think that is a genetic predisposition. Certain people are born with this chip, if you will, the psychopathic chip. But many of them, once again, they don't all become serial killers. Here's what seems to happen. Something happens around the age of puberty, around 12, 13 years old, where violence and sex somehow get twisted, get intertwined for them, and they become sexually aroused by violence and dead things. Ted Bundy talked about this. Dennis Rader strangled cats when he was an adolescent, and he became sexually aroused. Jeffrey Dahmer talked about finding dead animals in the woods and putting his hands inside of dead animals and becoming sexually aroused. So something happens, and it seems to happen right around puberty, where sex and violence become intertwined, and it becomes sexually arousing to them. And it doesn't just trigger overnight that they become serial killers. What happens is this develops over a period of years into their 20s, sometimes even into their early 30s, and they fantasize for years and years about killing and about being with dead things. Yeah. And it builds up to a point that it seems to reach a tipping point where they can't wait any longer, and they have to go out and actually kill. And BTK, Dennis Rader, explained this in his correspondence with me in great detail. Bundy, same thing. David Berkowitz, the son of Sam. This seems to be a very consistent pattern among these individuals.
Yeah, and it's interesting how Dennis Rader really described it. He would call it an X factor, if I'm recalling. So it sounds like he, in a sense, almost agrees with what you're talking about, that there's this X factor, and it could definitely be physiological, because like you said, I mean, there's probably millions of people who grew up in a similar upbringing of abuse or whatever it was that formed them, and they don't become serial killers or some negative thing. Even some of them come on to be presidents. So
that's right. That's right. Well, I mean, Dennis Rader is a classic example that his childhood, his upbringing, was pretty much normal as apple pie. I mean, he had the working class upbringing in small town USA, and grew up to become one of the most stone cold serial killers of all time. And so it's not necessarily linked in any way to an abusive upbringing, which is another, if not myth, at least misperception. And so these individuals, it's a series of very, very rare characteristics, starting with this psychopathic gene, and that is then triggered somehow around adolescence. And you're right, Dennis Rader has this name for it, Factor X, and he does not completely understand Factor X. He just knows that it's this overwhelming desire that he can't control. It's almost, I like to use the analogy. I don't know that it's a perfect analogy, but I think it helps us to understand it. It's almost like a drug addict or an alcoholic that simply cannot stop. When this urge for, the analogy being heroin, for example, a heroin addict cannot say no when the need arises. An alcoholic who needs a drink. Well, it seems to be the same way with these guys. When this urge compels them, they have to listen to it. They have to respond.
And you talk about how once it's triggered, or at least to me it seems like once it's triggered, I don't think it can be cured. And you seem to be a proponent of that idea too. You think it can be curbed, though. Talk about what you found there.
Yeah. Well, there is no known cure for being a psychopath, and it seems to be a genetic predisposition, and there is no known cure for it, because it's not like a mental illness that can be treated with medicine, medication, therapy, that sort of thing. It just can't. But what they do is they manage these individuals once they're apprehended, and they actually can become model prisoners. And the reason for that is their compulsiveness. They look forward to certain things. They look forward to reward-based treatment, things like treats, food that they like. And Dennis Rader had told me in letters that he has been a model citizen. He prides himself in being a model prisoner in Kansas, because he looks forward to reward-based treatment. They might give him, for example, an extra serving of a dessert that he likes or something like that, in exchange for not breaking any rules, behind bars. But his ability to break rules is extremely limited, because he's in isolation 23 hours a day. He's essentially in solitary confinement. But he prides himself in this. So they treat these psychopaths with essentially reward-based treatment, and it seems to work quite well. These are not individuals who are prone to emotional outbursts or anger, and they're very logical. They think very meticulously and logically. So if they believe it's in their best interest to cooperate because they're going to get a treat or get to watch some extra television or read a book or play a game or whatever, if they see that's in their best interest, then they're going to comply. So, it's interesting that they can be managed rather effectively, if not cured.
And that's why I think that there's almost, and I could be completely off with this, and please tell me if I am, that there's a bit of maybe a childlike or even stunted growth within serial killers and psychopaths, because when you're talking about this reward-based system to manage them, I'm a substitute teacher on the side as well, and that's a system that we use for the youngest of elementary kids to get them in line to pay attention to the rules. So that's why when you talk about the reward system, it almost made me think that there's this childlike stunted growth within serial killers. What do you think about that?
I think that's a very good observation, and I'll give you a tangible example of that sort of childlike naivete in a way. When Dennis Rader was caught, I'll explain a little bit about how he was caught. Please. He was really caught as a result of his own egomania.
Yeah.
He had been playing cat and mouse with the law enforcement detectives who were chasing him for some time. He would send them clues. I mean, it was a classic, whodunit. He would send them little clues, things to identify his murders. Catch me if you can. He was basically playing a game with them, and he reached a point where he felt that he actually had a personal relationship with a guy by the name of Ken Landwehr, who was the lead detective who had been chasing him for years, and may he rest in peace. By the way, Ken Landwehr passed away last year, but BTK reached out to Ken Landwehr and he said, Ken, I want to send you some information, a letter on a floppy disk. This was back when we were using floppy disks. And he said, now Ken, you can't trace any information from that from that disk, can you? And of course Ken Landwehr said, no, of course not. We can't, we couldn't possibly do that. So this is how they caught him. They Raiders sent Ken Landwehr a floppy disk, and on this disk was erased information that had been deleted from the disk, that, including the location, the address of the Lutheran church where Dennis Rader was the president of the church association. This is how they got him. They retrieved the deleted data from the floppy disk. Now, this seems so ridiculously careless
really
to you
does.
and I, but to Dennis Rader, it was a violation of their trust. When he was caught, one of the first things he did is he looked at Detective Landwehr, and he said, Ken, I thought we were friends. Why would you lie to me? I can't believe you lied to me. And Ken Landwehr said, because I was trying to catch you. You're a killer. I was trying to catch you. What do you think? And so Rader, in his strange way, had these principles, and he thought that they had been violated. His trust had been violated. So it is almost like a childlike thing that you were describing.
Yeah, it's almost unbelievable that someone who takes obviously all this care to cover up his tracks wouldn't even would just send this information away. But sometimes I guess truth is stranger than fiction, and that just really proves it.
Yeah, well, and also it's an indication of his narcissism,
right,
and how badly he needed attention. How badly he needed attention. He's such a fascinating case in so many ways, because his ego is just enormous. He's in an 8x10 cell, and I doubt that his ego fits neatly within that 8x10 cell, because it's massive. He doesn't even like the distinction of serial killer. He considers himself a terrorist of society, and because serial killer is just too narrow a definition for him. And his rationalization is this: he said most serial killers, standard serial killers, have a victim type that they like, just blonde women or dark-haired women, whatever it might be. BTK killed men, women, and even children. So he said, you never knew. You might be the next one. No one knew if they might be the next victim of BTK. So he saw himself as a terrorist of society.
Yeah, he really was. Sculpting his image really seemed to be really important to him, and he wanted to be, to me, considered a serial killer amongst serial killers, so to speak.
Oh, without a doubt. He scoffed. When I told him that I was also writing to David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, who in fact really is even more infamous, has greater, I would say, notoriety
right,
than BTK, he scoffed at that, and his reaction was essentially, he's not even a real serial killer. He didn't like to get his hands dirty. He used a gun. Real serial killers strangle, which is so it's he was scoffing at David Berkowitz. Yet I actually believe that he was jealous of Berkowitz's infamy, and the fact that Son of Sam is actually probably in history a bigger brand name among serial killers, if you will, than BTK.
Yeah, and with both of those killers that you had a chance to correspond with, and other serial killers as well, there seems to be some religious undertones when it comes to these conversations. Specifically, really the concept of God, and it really does seem to have a role in some of the serial killers' life. Some of them were Satanists. Some of them even considered themselves avenging angels, and I'm wondering on that topic. Some of them, even the serial killers, said that they felt like God when they did the killing. What are your thoughts on that, and really the serial killer's belief system in God?
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting question. There was a guy, Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, who died actually last year of liver failure. He was on death row, and he had been for many, many years, and very, very prolific serial killer out in California. And he was a Satanist, and in many ways I think he considered himself to be Satan. He relished the notion of evil. He believed that he was evil. He believed that evil was manifested in its deeds, and he relished that label. BTK it's an interesting thing with him. He talked about God a lot too, but he was able to compartmentalize, because it sounds completely irrational, but on the one hand, he would say he's a very religious man, he's a Christian, and have no compunction about telling you that he is absolutely a Christian, he believes in God, and yet he sees absolutely nothing wrong with torturing and killing other human beings. He sees nothing wrong with it. And his rationalization is that he himself is a natural-born killer. He, unlike Richard Ramirez, BTK doesn't seem to believe in the notion of evil. Rather than evil, he believes that his killings, once again, were manifested or a result of this thing called Factor X that he had no control over. Therefore, he's not responsible. Which, if you think about it, it's a very convenient rationalization. It's God's doing. It's not mine. I'm a child of God. God made me this way, so therefore I am, and it's not me. It's sort of a circular logic. But that's his rationalization. He sees himself as a true natural-born killer. He likens himself. Not only does he describe himself like a shark or like a hawk or a snake, he actually, and I talk about this in my book, when he signs his letters, he signs the name Dennis in the shape of a shark. He's created his own prison logo, if you will.
And the thing with sharks is that they have to keep swimming or else they're going to die. So, that's a concept I was thinking about as I was reading the part 2 when you were talking about your correspondences, specifically with, Son of Sam, how he's now a spiritual advisor, obviously a bit of irony there. You even wrote that he moved you, and that you believe that he's a contributing member of society. And isn't part of a serial killer's MO to manipulate? Did you ever feel like you were being manipulated by them?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. And I actually had the opportunity to sit face to face with David Berkowitz, who, the infamous Son of Sam, for almost 5 hours, spring of 2013. I was able to sit with him for the better part of a day, and we talked about everything you can possibly imagine. We had lunch together, and he's a different case. I do not believe that David Berkowitz is a psychopath. Here's my take on David Berkowitz. He was a very disturbed, isolated young man who was looking for some kind of meaning in his life. And some of your listeners may be aware of the legend. The legend of the Son of Sam is that this dog named Harvey in Yonkers, New York, that was owned by his next-door neighbor, Sam Carr, was barking at night, and that this dog was a demon and somehow drove him to kill, that this demonic dog drove him to kill. I believe that this is just mythology. It's a legend that's been perpetuated by both law enforcement and the media for decades, and I don't think that it has the basis in reality. Here's what I really think. David Berkowitz, as I said, was an emotionally troubled young man. He's never been determined to be mentally ill. He's never been on any medication. But here's what happened. He went into the Army at the age of 18, and he was looking for some kind of meaning in his life. He told me this. He felt like he lacked a purpose. He wanted direction. He thought he'd find it in the Army. It didn't happen. He came out, and he became interested in the occult and Satan specifically, and he became a Satanist. He began to worship Satan. Part of this legend, this mythological legend of Son of Sam, is that he was part of a cult, and that he didn't act alone, that he killed along with others. I also think that's pure mythology. He told me that he acted alone, but he did become obsessed with Satan. Now, here's what happened. After a couple of years, he became so obsessed and so focused on Satan that he came to believe that if he killed for Satan, that somehow he would find meaning and purpose and ultimately some sort of satisfaction in his life. And so he began killing. But much like a drug addict, once again, the high never came. The high never was as good as the fantasy leading up to it. So he killed again and again, hoping that Satan would relieve him of his pain and then he'd find some purpose. It never happened, and he finally was caught. And when he went to prison, again, he was not deemed to be mentally ill. He was placed in maximum security prison, and he was hated by his fellow inmates. In fact, they slashed his throat at Attica. He almost died. He got 60 stitches, and it's a very nasty scar he's got on his throat. Well, after nearly 1 decade in prison, he felt so lost and despondent, and he simply lost the will to live. And he told me he wanted to die. By 1986, he wanted to die. He was captured in 1977. And so by 86, he wanted to die. He told me that one night he fell on his knees in prison, and he just cried out to God for help. And this is the way he tells the story. He said that I was touched by the hand of God that night, and everything was lifted and taken away. My pain, God forgave me for my sins, and since that moment, in the late 80s, he has turned his life over to God and to helping being of use behind bars any way he can. Now, the thing that's incredible, that I find so incredible, is he has actually been embraced by a portion of the evangelical community. There is a website dedicated to him called ariseandshine.org, and hundreds of thousands of people from all over the world have come to read his messages of hope and transformation. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. It's absolutely incredible. He has become a source of hope and inspiration to sick people, cancer patients, mentally ill people, desperate people around the world. And in person, he is incredibly sincere, seemingly sincere, and remorseful. He wept openly in front of me as he talked about his murders. He has reached out to the families of some of his victims and actually reconciled with one of them who have forgiven him. And he knows that people scoff at this. He knows that people think that it's just, he's looking for attention or whatever. But the reality is, he's never going to get out of prison. He knows that. He doesn't get any better treatment because of it. But he helps his fellow inmates. He's in a prison where the Sullivan Correctional Facility, upstate New York, which is a maximum security prison. I mean, it's a very, very frightening, grim place. And many of the prisoners there are lifers like himself, who are either physically or emotionally, mentally handicapped in some way. So he serves as a mobility guide to help these people, get around, to help them read and write. He's as you mentioned, a spiritual advisor. He works with the chaplain in the church, or excuse me, in the prison there. So it's the whole thing is just rather amazing. And people ask me all the time, do you believe him? And I am not in a position to say whether this man is sincere or not, other than the fact that he seems sincere. He seems to believe it. His emotions are such that he becomes welled up with emotion when he talks about his murders and God, and he would do anything to undo it. And if he's acting, I would say that he deserves an Academy Award. He's the Daniel Day-Lewis of serial killers, because he's one heck of an actor if he is acting. And I actually take a very pragmatic approach to this. If he's helping his fellow prisoners, and if he serves as any inspiration, or he's helping sick people that he corresponds with, he writes letters all the time around the world, and if he makes one person feel better, then let him continue to do it. He's not. He's going to stay right where he is, not going anywhere. So let him. The actions speak for themselves. If he's helping people, let him continue to do it. Is my take on this. But this is just truth is stranger than fiction. You
It really is.
Make up this transformation. He once was son of Sam. He now calls himself the son of Hope.
Yeah, what a crock of ass in my opinion. But and I think, but here's the thing with him. He's the perfect example of really what I took away from the book. This idea of gray, blurred lines, and that I found myself obviously disgusted by the serial killers. But then again, I thought, really a lot of it comes down to subjectivity and cultural relativism. Some cultures have these type of rituals that serial killers perform, and that they do as part of their rituals on a daily basis, the things that serial killers do. And, I found myself hating the people who collect murderabilia, but then again, I'm the one who reached out to you for an interview because I thought it would be a fascinating show. So in a sense, I'm almost contributing to the obsession in it. So there's really this idea of gray, blurred lines that I really took away from the book.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, and I really agree with you. And the classic example of the blurred lines is the Jeffrey Dahmer Hannibal Lecter connection. It goes back a ways, but it's important to bring up. In 1991, that's the year that Jeffrey Dahmer was caught, and the world found out that he had been capturing, trying to make live zombies, killing and eating 17 men. Well, 1991 also happened to be the year that Anthony Hopkins immortalized Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs. And the news and entertainment media mirrored one another. Jeffrey Dahmer became known as the real-life Hannibal Lecter, and the two became conflated and synonymous with one another. And I argue that this sensationalization that we do as a society, the media, law enforcement, and the public itself, we blur the lines, and it all becomes entertainment. We buy the books, we read the newspapers, and unless one of these individuals comes knocking on your door, unless Ted Bundy shows up on your doorstep, it isn't really real. It's just popcorn entertainment. And again, that's where the danger comes in, that we lose sight of the victims and their families and people who are really being destroyed by these individuals.
And that's really why your work is so important. And unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I want to make sure we have some moments to give your social media site. So share some of those before we let you go.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, the book, Why We Love Serial Killers, The Curious Appeal of the World's Most Savage Murderers, is available in bookstores. It's available on Amazon. In fact, it's also available in ebook, on Kindle, and audiobook, too. And it's also available in Nook and paperback on Barnes & Noble. And yes, I have a blog, a regular crime blog that I do for psychologytoday.com, and the name of the blog is Wicked Deeds, and I blog there frequently about all sorts of crime issues, but serial killers in particular. And so I invite your listeners to check that out, and I also website, docbonn.com, DOCBONN.com, which has a lot of my articles and TV interviews and things. So there you go.
And I highly recommend the listener getting the book. It was really, I finished it in probably 2 or 3 days at most. One of the quickest reads I had in a long time. Absolutely fascinating, and really appreciate the contributions that you're bringing to the table here.
Well, thank you so much, and it's been a great pleasure. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Dr. Scott Bonn. Thank you so much for discussing your latest, Why We Love Serial Killers.
Take care. Thank you.
You too. We'll be in touch.
Bye-bye.
And for links to Dr. Bonn's social media info, we already have it up on the website. Check it over, themindseyemedia.com. Once more, themindseyemedia.com. We also has it up on our Facebook page, facebook.com/mindseyeshow. And join me again in 2 weeks on March 3rd, 2015 with Zachary Steigler, Assistant Professor of Media Communications. We're going to be talking about, well, really, there's a reason why we're skipping 2 weeks. And that reason is because Professor Steigler is going to discuss the ramifications of next week's FCC decision on net neutrality. So we'll be talking about that and his latest book, Regulating the Web